Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Mr. Wright here. Today we're just going to be going through a lesson on the United Nations. Now what you are going to notice in a bit when this video uploads on Classroom is that there's some other smaller PowerPoints I'm going to attach as well. They're just things that aren't necessarily as important, so I'm not going to include them in the video lesson. We're just going to focus right now on the actual United Nations. So you see a couple other slideshows up there that don't have videos that go with it. Don't worry about it, still read through them, but it is not it's not important enough that we're going to talk about it here in the video. Okay, so the United Nations. Okay, this is the United Nations building right here. It's located in New York City. So what is the UN? So the UN is essentially the world's international government. It's known as a supranationalist organization. So what supranationalist means essentially is that it's a government that supersedes all governments, right? It's super and it's nationalist. So it is like the ultimate nationalist government. So it was created in 1945 following the end of World War One, or at least the German surrender in World War One or World War Two. I'm sorry. And its main goal here was to essentially create an international institution for the rest of the global community to essentially resolve their conflicts peacefully. So essentially, it's the better version of the League of Nations. If you remember about the League of Nations, was created after World War One, and its failures were in part responsible for World War Two. So currently, there are 193 member states in the UN. Now, I made this slideshow 2 or 3 years ago, so that number could have changed a little bit. So you might want to Google that for a more accurate number. And the mission and the work of the UN is guided by its founding charter. So what a charter is essentially a set of rules and guidelines that you have to follow. And it's kind of like the plan or the outline for what your organization is going to do. It's very similar to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So the UN is currently led by the Secretary General, who acts as the chief administrator. And right now, that is Antonio Guterres of Portugal. And that's his picture right there. So he's essentially the leader of the organization. So again, as of 2017, these green countries are all the countries that are part of the UN. So you have Western Sahara over here that is not, I think that's the only visible country on here that is not a member. There are some smaller ones, like if you get down into like the Vatican isn't a member, but Western Sahara is that area right there. So it was created under the leadership of President Franklin D. Roosevelt on January 1st, 1942. Now, it was not the United Nations that we know of now. It was just a group, it was like a military alliance, a bunch of nations that were united together to help defeat Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II. So there was only 26 countries when it formed. And it wasn't until October 24th of 1945 that the UN that we know today came into existence. So at this point, it was made up of 50 different countries. They met in San Francisco. They signed the charter, which brought in one more nation. And now we know October 24th as United Nations Day. So it's based out in New York City. Again, it's these buildings right in here. And this right here is the General Assembly, which is essentially like a big lecture hall where representatives from all countries are able to go and raise and discuss their issues. So it has 5 main objectives: to maintain peace and international security, to protect human rights, and to deliver humanitarian aid, not humanization aid, I should say humanitarian, but too bad, and promote sustainable development and uphold international law. So that's 5 main goals. So the different sections of the UN are known as the organs of the UN. It's kind of a gross term, but I'm not the one that got to pick it. Now there are 6, but we're just going to concern ourselves with 3, the 3 bolded ones here: the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the International Court of Justice. That's not to say the Economic and Social Councils are not important, or the Trustee Council or the Secretariat, but they're just not important for your course. So the General Assembly, it's the only group in the UN in which every member nation has representation. So the other ones, International Court and the Security Council, do not include all member states. Only the General Assembly includes all of them. So the UNGA is the main deliberative and policy-making organ of the UN, and its powers include overseeing the budget, so appointing how much money goes where, appointing non-permanent members of the Security Council, which we'll get to in a little bit, but non-permanent means members that aren't always there, They receive reports from other sections of the UN, and they also make recommendations in the form of General Assembly resolutions. So they can basically make a vote on an issue, and that issue, if it's passed in the General Assembly, would go on to the more applicable group later on, like Security Council or the Economic and Social Council or the trustee of the Secretariat, where essentially those decisions would be kind of pushed along further. So this is just basically like a big democracy. Everybody talks, they vote on things, and if it passes in there, it moves along its way. So these meetings are held annually in New York City, and the Secretary General, so that'd be Antonio Gutierrez, right now leads the meetings. These meetings last from September to December, so a few months, and then if they do not settle all their issues in that period, then they come back in January and they meet until all their issues are addressed. They can also reconvene in case of an emergency. So if war was declared somewhere in the middle of July, they could come back together and they could meet and discuss it then. So members of the General Assembly vote on recommendations on peace and security. So these recommendations then go on to the Security Council, who has kind of the more power in that area. They can pass the budget, and they can add, suspend, or remove people from the UN itself. And to do so, they need a 2/3 majority. So if Western Sahara wanted to join the United Nations, 2/3 of members of the United Nations General Assembly would have to vote to pass them. And if they wanted to kick out a country like a North Korea, like an Iran, they would have to get a 2/3 majority to expel them. And this does happen. Countries are expelled and readmitted all the time. So the Security Council, this is the most powerful group at the United Nations. They hold the most power, specifically when it comes to things like war and peacekeeping. So their job is to maintain international peace and security. So they only meet when world peace is essentially threatened. So anytime war breaks out or a genocide occurs or civil war breaks out, they meet and they basically come up with a plan for how the UN is going to respond, or if they're going to respond to these issues. So when your country joins the UN, you are essentially agreeing that even if you are not on the Security Council, and only 15 countries are on the Security Council at any time, that you will accept and carry out the decision of the Security Council. So this is kind of like when we have elected leaders in government. It's when they're elected in, we basically say, once you're in, we will follow the laws and the policies that you create. Now, only the Security Council has the power to make decisions on peace and security. So another organization can essentially make international decisions on peace and security that only lies in the Security Council. So their main goal, again, is to maintain peace and security. So when an issue threatens peace, it's brought to the Security Council. They get a recommendation from the General Assembly. So the General Assembly, that big group of the 190 odd countries, they basically say, this is what we would like to do. And then they pass that on to the Security Council. The Security Council would read that resolution, and they would essentially make a decision on it. So they could agree with the resolution, and they could essentially set the terms for peace based on what the General Assembly has given them. So if they read it, they like it, they say, yep, this is what we're going to do, and they pass it, and it's very easy. Now, they can also decline it and say, no, we're not going to do this, and that's the end of it. They can decide to bring forth an investigation. So they may say, this issue right now doesn't need a yes or a no, go to war, not go to war, punish, not punish. We need to investigate. So if you remember back in Rwandan genocide, the United Nations Security Council did decide to dispatch an investigation mission and mediation to Rwanda. So they sent a group of peacekeepers, they set special envoys and representatives to go there and try to find a diplomatic solution. And they can also request that the Secretary General use his influence to essentially peacefully settle these disputes. Now remember, out of 200 odd countries in the world, 190 of them are in the UN. So it's most likely these conflicts are going to break out in UN member nations. So the Security Council can essentially say, we're going to investigate it, we're going to send diplomats, and then we're going to try to use the UN itself to kind of use their leverage or their influence to try to create a peace. Now, when these disputes are kind of past the investigation phase, and we kind of realize it's going to lead to war, whether it's civil war, international war, the Security Council essentially has to decide what they're going to do. So they have to decide, are they going to get involved in the conflict or are they not? Now, for the Security Council to actually have a just reason to get involved in a conflict, they have to basically be able to determine that that conflict threatens global peace, right? The UN has no power to go into independent nation states and tell them how to run their country within their own borders. So if, let's just say in Canada, a civil war broke out and the only people involved in that civil war were Canadians, so no Canadian refugees were fleeing, Canada was not attacking like the United States or Mexico involved in this, and it was only affecting Canadian citizens, the UN Security Council cannot do anything about that. Because all the UN Security Council is supposed to do is be worried about global peace and global security. So if they determine that the conflict going on within that nation's borders do not threaten the rest of the world, they cannot do anything, or at least they should vote not to do anything. Now, if they determine that this conflict does threaten another sovereign nation, so if like the hypothetical war in Canada did spill over to the United States, then the United Nations Security Council can essentially make a couple decisions. They can either issue a ceasefire, which is essentially a ban on gunfire. So they basically say everyone's going to stop. Everyone's going to stop shooting at each other, bombing each other, and we are going to sit down in a room and we're going to discuss this. They also, if they think the ceasefire isn't going to work, they can dispatch military observers or peacekeepers, where they're going to send them to these areas, and they're going to be, these peacekeepers are going to be ordered not to get involved in the conflict, and we're going to get into what a peacekeeper and a peacemaker are a little bit later on in a different video, to get in there and essentially reduce the tension. So peacekeepers essentially get between the two sides, and they stop them from shooting at each other. Peacekeepers can't shoot unless they're shot upon. They basically get between the two sides to put a barrier, and then they try to negotiate a peace. Now, the UN Security Council can also send in a full-on military in order to get involved in the conflict. That would be a peacemaker. So the council, what they've essentially done before, the peacekeepers have not been effective, they can put economic sanctions in. So they can essentially ban trade with certain countries. They can stop sending them weapons. They can basically put fines or taxes on them. They can ban travel and all these sorts of things. So if you were to look at a place like North Korea right now, North Korea has a ton of sanctions on it. Okay, North Korea, when they're developing their nukes and they're testing and firing all these different nuclear weapons, the Security Council essentially has put economic penalties on them. They've banned trade. People cannot travel to North Korea. So they can do that. They can also essentially sever diplomatic relations, say no country in the United Nations will anymore be an ally of this nation. They can put a blockade, that shouldn't say a blockage, but a blockade would essentially be, if you look up here, the Security Council, the sea there is an island. They can put their ships or whatever all around that island to stop any trade from going in or out. And then the last option is the UN Security Council can actually send in a force of UN troops. So every UN nation contributes some troops to UN or missions, military missions. So if the Security Council decides they need to send in a UN army, like they would take like 1,000 people from the Canadian military, 1,000 from the French, 1,000 from the British, and they would send them as one cohesive army into conflict to essentially fight to restore peace. So the Security Council is made up of 15 members. Now, 5 of these members never change. France, China, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States are always and will always be on the Security Council. They are the permanent member states. These are the 5 most powerful countries in the world in terms of the United Nations. Now, the other 10 are made up of countries that are elected to 2-year terms. So this list has changed most likely since I made this slideshow. But essentially, each of these countries here back in 2017 would be on the Security Council. Now, they would all get a vote and all get to share their opinion on Security Council issues. But at the end of the day, all the power lies with China, France, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The 10 non-permanent member states don't have the same level of power. So what I mean by that is each group gets 1 vote. That's great. Okay, that's how democracy is supposed to work. There's 15, there should always be a majority. Now, all decisions made by the Security Council must have 9 yes votes. So that's a 2/3 majority. You're going to see that with everything in the UN. It needs to be a 2/3 majority. So in order for this, 9 of the 15 countries must vote yes. Now, the kicker, or kind of the string attached here, is that This must include all 5 permanent member states saying yes. If one or more of the non-permanent member states say no, that automatically cancels it because of something called the veto. Okay, all 5 permanent members of the Security Council, so the United States, China, Russia, France, and Britain, they have a veto decision. If any of those 5 countries ever vote no on anything, then the mission does not happen. Now, what can happen is if a nation chooses not to vote, they can abstain from the vote, which means they won't vote. And then, since they haven't voted no, the motion can still pass. But essentially, China, the United States, Russia, France, and Britain can say no to any mission at any time, and the mission does not happen. This veto gets used a lot. And it gets used a lot because you basically have 2 different sides of these 5 permanent member states. If we go back to the slide before, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States typically are very good allies in most international issues. They're pro-democratic, they're pro-capitalist, they're all these sorts of things. China and Russia are slightly more dictatorships. Russia technically is a democracy, but it's a rigged democracy. China's a communist state. Russia and China very rarely see on the same side as France, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And as such, anything that France, the United States, or the UK wants to do, China or Russia will veto, and anything that China and Russia want to do, the United States, Great Britain, or France will say no and veto. So not a lot actually gets done. So again, as of 2017, these were the most recent vetoes used. So Russia vetoed a decision to end the bombing of Aleppo, Syria. So I'm sure you guys are all aware that Syria's kind of been in a state of civil war for the past 10 years. And what was happening is that the government of Syria was bombing the city of Aleppo because that's where the rebels were. The rebels that were trying to overthrow the government were based out of Aleppo. So the government of Syria was bombing them. So China, France, Russia, or China, France, the United States, and Great Britain all wanted to put a ban on that. Russia said no. On the 29th of 2015, Russia vetoed a decision to set up an investigation into a missing plane that was shot down over the Ukraine. Well, it was shot down, but nobody knows where it actually was. So a plane that was flying from Malaysia to the Ukraine suddenly went missing. And the other Security Council countries wanted to investigate it, and Russia said, no, we're not going to investigate that. So nobody's actually investigated it. On May 22nd of 2014, Russia and China both decided to veto a decision that would condemn the state of Syria and their government. The government of Syria, Assad, is a very bad man. So the UN wanted to essentially condemn him and try to get him to step down, and Russia and China said, we're not going to do that. In 2011, the United States vetoed a resolution condemning the settlement of Israeli people in the West Bank of Palestine. So essentially, the Israeli people were moving outside of their set borders and kind of sort of invading Palestine, and the rest of the UN said, that's not good, we should say no to that, and the United States said, no, we like Israel, we're going to let them do that. And then that would where it says France, Britain, and the United States. That's back in World War II, where the United States essentially invaded Panama to build the Panama Canal. And Russia and China, like, you can't do that, that's not good. And France, Britain, and the United States said, we're going to do it anyways. So the possible motivations here, I'll let you guys kind of speculate a bit on that. So the next group is the International Court of Justice, which is also known as the World Court, the ICJ, or the Hague, and it's called the Hague. It's located in the city of Hague, Netherlands. And it essentially settles legal disputes internationally. So it can be international crimes, it can be disputes between 2 different nations, but it's basically just a giant court. Now, you don't really need to know how it's made up here, but the information's there if you want to read it. You just basically need to know what it does. The seats on the International Court out of the 15 judges, they all serve 9-year terms, which is a really weird amount of time, but they're broken up by geographic region. So in 2017, and these should still be the countries, these are the ones that held seats. And that's it. So that's the end of our UN lesson. I know that's a lot of content, but read through the slides. You don't need to know a ton about the UN besides really how the Security Council and the General Assembly all work. So that's it for this lesson. There'll be another one coming up very, very shortly in your next class about some of the problems with the United Nations, and then we'll go into a little bit about peacekeeping and peacemaking, and we'll have some readings to do on that. So thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you later.